In this video narrative, we will continue our examination and commentary on the fourth major group of primary institutions, called social and leadership. This is part 2 of a 4-part video narrative. Another social force, although smaller in scope, yet still a negative influence upon our national community of America, is modern-day slavery and human trafficking. The facts are quite real and getting worse, and this is the reason why we mention this negative social force, mainly because modern-day slavery and trafficking is often a parallel activity of the very same thugs who are heavily smuggling drugs into our country. And as the drug trade has grown, so has modern-day slavery. It is projected that around 17,500 people are trafficked into the U.S. each year, and then enslaved into a life of prostitution, forced labor, drug addiction, and regular beatings. The State Department estimates there are 20 million people enslaved around the world, and only a tiny fraction of them are ever identified as victims of human trafficking. So you could say there's a whole lot of suffering going on, and the people enslaved are least able to defend themselves. And of course, we have our share of violent crime in the U.S., another firm indication of cultural deterioration, especially as we see the murder rates climbing in our major cities. In fact, murders are up in many U.S. cities, based on statistics as of December 2016. 30 of the largest U.S. cities saw a double-digit increase in their violent murders. The New York University Brennan Center for Justice projected that the murder rate for the largest U.S. cities is up 14%. Many exclaim it's happening, but seem at a loss to explain why. Isn't it curious that the big cities where violent crime is rising, such as murder, rapes, and robberies, are run by liberal progressive mayors, typically from the left of the center in the Democratic Party? And these same cities have been controlled by liberal Democrats with their social entitlement programs, their backing of organized labor, for decades. And interestingly, these cities are spiraling to social decay and greater poverty, with the most grave consequence to the indigenous poor people who live there, especially their children. And Chicago is a prime example, ruled by Democrats for decades, spending year after year many billions on social programs, and we see the safety within the city plummet, as the murder rate there has been climbing, soaring 72% in 2016, and shootings up 88%. Just look at those statistics. 708 shot and killed in 2016, over 3,600 wounded, with over 4,300 shot, and homicides totaling 788. Community. Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, Oakland, Memphis, Birmingham, Los Angeles, Stockton, Baltimore, Austin, Atlanta, Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Milwaukee. Pick one. They're all getting worse. And there's an indisputable correlation with failed liberal leadership and progressive policies, all of which have collapsed social forces upon the victims' families and the communities in whole. And know very clearly, the young and innocent, along with the thugs, are being slaughtered by gangs and drug violence. Are you feeling safe in America? If you are, you're fortunate, because many millions of people are not, and for good reason. You may have heard in the news in 2017 how the Trump administration is going after violent gangs, felons, and illegal criminal immigrants, especially the violent gang called MS-13. The U.S. Justice Department and federal law enforcement agencies are working to clean up and reduce the mess the prior administration left them. The social force of violent gangs in America is an exceedingly toxic one to families and communities alike, as these gangs are terrorizing and poisoning our streets with drugs, violence, and all matters of crime. Many Americans don't have any perspective on how large and threatening this problem really is. Sit back, we're going to bring you up to date. How many violent gang members do you think there are in the United States today? Just the violent ones. 50,000? How about 100,000? Do you think 200,000? Try 1,150,000, and there's over 24,000 nasty street and prison gangs, and 40% of gang membership is under the age of 18. And of course, they aren't making fruit baskets for the poor and sick. Glance at the bottom right of the screen, and you'll see how they busy their time. And another question, how many active sworn law enforcement officers do you think we have in the U.S.? Well, the best answer seems to come from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, and they say the number is 900,000. And these officers are busy full-time dealing with all regular crimes and daily emergencies in thousands of communities across the nation. Here's an unsettling fact. If things ever get out of control, and the police were overwhelmed, which typically happens when riots break out, we only have 1.2 million active military in our entire nation's defense. Do the math. God help us if the gangs ever get organized together, and don't think it can't happen. During the riots in 2016 over police shootings, two of the biggest nationwide gangs, the Blood and the Crips, worked together in protest in several major metropolitan areas. The cohesion has started. If anything, so far in this presentation, we hope we've conveyed to you one unsettling reality. The structure of our social fabric is tearing apart under the weight of violence, gangs, crime, and the corruption it all brings. And these negative social forces are actively placing our entire way of life at risk. This is no longer an academic debate subject. It's an urgent and highly volatile issue the nation must grapple with and deal with successfully. There's a saying used when investigators are trying to figure out a crime of great size or complexity. Just follow the money. It's so true. Where the money came from, where it is, and where it goes, almost always unmasks both crime and criminal. Money is corruptive, and a lot of money, like in the illegal drug trade, is highly corruptive, especially to the institutions within society. The money from the drug trade has been ruinous to our culture, corrupting lawyers and judges, and law enforcement officials at federal, state, and local levels of the U.S. government, corrupting bankers and businessmen smelling the money train. The drug cartels are awash in cash, a lot of cash, in fact, mountains of cash, blood money, all of it, and they rely upon big banks to launder this cash in order to get it credited into the legitimate world financial system. And to do that, they need a way in, and many of our big banks suffer from greedy and dark personalities inside them, people who are more than willing to do the business with the cartels, bank managers who willingly compromise the bank's integrity by washing the dirty money. Represented are several of the big banks which have been caught laundering drug proceeds and have accepted fines and other penalties for their proven guilt. Here, seeing the logos of some of the biggest money firms in the nation and knowing that they've been caught for drug money transactions clearly demonstrates how the drug trade is able to penetrate legitimate business with its deadly toxicity. Another troublesome social force in America, occurring over the past few decades and with greater frequency in the new millennium, is mass murders. Unquestionably, mass murders reflect a very dark social force eating at our culture, a social force that is ugly but real, a social force that is hateful and toxic, a social force driven by a corruption of violence, and it is poisoning our culture and killing our children. In the United States, mass shootings have been occurring with macabre frequency since the mid-1990s. Not that they didn't occur before, mind you, but the frequency has accelerated, and the killings have intensified. We often forget how much has happened until presented with a list to remind us. It's human to want to forget such horror and to put it out of our mind and get through the day and the next day. But it is necessary that we remember and never forget. It is necessary that we grapple with this dark social force cursing our nation. Mass murders or mass shootings are a rupture within the social and human fabric of our society, and they are indicative of something wrong, deeply wrong, in and across our culture. Something that is off, festering, and volatile. Something that is violent, hateful, and utterly devastating to lives, families, and communities. Something that would enable a young man to shoot little children in their classroom. In the United States, between 1995 and 2015, there have been 49 mass shootings, with 384 killed, 287 wounded, and we're excluding mass shootings involving family or domestic disputes. Take a look at the chart to the right. We list all the mass shootings during the time period between 1995 and 2015. You can see in the blue box 11 mass shootings occurring in the 1990s, and then framed in the red box, we see the accelerations of shootings between 2000 and 2015, rocket up to 38. Why? What changed in America in this time period, which would usher in such a dark manifestation? And yes, there's more we can add in 2016 and 2017. In 2016, we had the Dallas mass shootings, ambush style, killing 5 police officers and wounding many. It's always especially tragic when first responders are gunned down, and that was the case in Dallas. In 2017, the killing continues, with another mass shooting in Orlando, Florida, a workplace violence situation where 5 people were killed by a disgruntled employee. Typically, in these shootings, once investigated and understood, the source of violence almost always traces back to something. Do you think it might have anything to do with a weakening of faith or moral standards, which have historically placed the value of human life at the forefront of society? Or do you think it might have something to do with an intentional diminishing of cultural integrity and normative standards, as manifested by moral relativity and its offspring, political correctness? Whatever it is, as a people, as a national community, we must recognize mass murders as a real and ongoing scourge of our society. And regardless of where we may live, or what we might do, or our personal ideological beliefs, all of us, our politicians and leaders in every institution, the noble and the common, must find a way to combat and control this menace, or it will continue to grow and devour our culture. Well, we know that much of what we've been talking about is trying, if not downright depressing, so don't get too down. We're hitting on a lot of troublesome issues that are both necessary for us to understand without the fog of political correctness or liberal falsehood. You can't change a negative social force unless you understand it and are convicted to reversing it. And we're not done yet. We've got a few more big subjects yet to cover in this section on social and leadership, and the remaining subjects, unfortunately, are all in a very dark corner of humanity. Social forces which are posing great threat, intimate and present danger of the largest scale, global in consequence and existential in severity, to humanity here in America and throughout the world. As we've asked before, do you feel safe in America? Well, now we're asking the question again, but we're expanding the content. Are you feeling safe in today's world? Sometimes it's difficult to look beyond our immediate environment and contemplate the big issues going on in the world. Yet in many ways they do impact our lives, and to ignore them invites peril. So let's not turn our minds away, but take a close look to better understand the nature of what we're really up against. The first dark social issue is a big one, and growing every day. It represents a major threat to all humanity, to human dignity and freedom, to democracy and especially Western values, to civility and peace. We are, of course, talking about terrorism. And in particular, the extremism demonstrated by vicious Islamic radicalism, an extremist ideology which is attempting to overthrow Western and free cultures across the world, with a corrupted form of the Islamic religion, which calls for a world governed by an Islamic caliphate, subject to Sharia law, and further mandating all infidels either convert to Islam or to be slain. Well, doesn't that sound a little insane to a reasonable mind? Here's a quick chart from the Global Terrorism Database, graphing the number of terrorist incidents worldwide, from 1970 to about 2015. It highlights there is a very dark cloud on our horizon. The storm of terrorism is upon us and quickly metastasizing across the world. And on the chart to the right, we can see depicted the types of terrorism being inflicted against innocent people all over the world. Bombings, explosions, and armed assaults against defenseless civilians, men, women, and children. Since 2015, 3 countries have been subjected to the majority of terror incidences and killing: war-torn Iraq, Nigeria, and Afghanistan. All 3 countries have Islamic radicals running one or more ideological groups against the national authorities, and in each, the Islamic radicals are either aligned with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They are determined to crush civil order and replace it with the tyranny of death and radical theology. 49% of all terror incidences have occurred in 4 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Although we are now starting to see a growing frequency of terrorist attacks in Europe and other Western nations, as ISIS is being confronted and defeated in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. It is violently reaching out with spasms of bombing and murder to remind us all they're still in the business of terror. To the point, we see a number of Western nations getting hit. Interestingly, the U.S. represents 1/3 of all terror attacks or plots in the Western nations between 2014 and mid-2016. And we see an alarming result taking place: terrorist-related deaths dramatically escalating. In 1 year, we see an increase in terror-related deaths of 650%. Here depicted are the number of terrorist incidences in 2014, represented in a heat map showing in what area of the world where 13,370 terror incidents occurred, killing nearly 33,000 people. The vast majority, of course, were innocent, mainly women and children. In 2015, the carnage in the Middle East and Africa was relentless, spreading unfolding suffering, mutilation, and death across ancient civilizations. Nigeria, Yemen, Kenya, Cameroon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Hundreds of lives are shredded in seconds, and thousands of others are wounded and maimed for life. 2015 also marked a bloody extension by ISIS and Al-Qaeda to other parts of the world, as their fervor for radicalism grew, and their thirst for killing could not be quenched. In January, ISIS attacked the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris, killing 11 and wounding 11. France went into shock, and the rest of civilized society soon followed. And then in November, Paris, France gets attacked again. ISIS kills 130 and wounds hundreds. Innocent people enjoying a concert or a dinner at the nearby restaurants are mercilessly gunned down, many picked off as they crouched for cover. And just a month later in December, America gets hit. 14 are slain in San Bernardino, California, and 22 are wounded. The Islamic couple responsible have sworn allegiance to ISIS, and the people begin to connect the dots. Fort Hood, Boston, and begin to realize more fully America isn't safe under Barack Obama's liberal and dismissive attitude towards ISIS and Islamic extremism. In 2016, the attacks continue. On March 25th, Brussels is attacked at their airport and metro station. Suicide bombers detonate amongst the crowds of innocents. 34 are dead and 300 injured, right in the capital of the European Union. On June 12th, America gets hit again. A lone gunman slaughters 49 people in an Orlando, Florida nightclub. On June 28th, ISIS attacks the Istanbul airport, killing 48 and injuring 239. On July 3rd, Iraq is brutally attacked. 341 people are killed with dozens injured. Iraq, over the course of 2016, suffers unspeakable carnage. In a nation weak for men, women, and children, whose lives have been shattered with a cruelty which sounds across the planet. From January to April, bombing after bombing, the slaughter of innocents is unending, killing hundreds. Continuing through November, with many more killings by bombs, ISIS plunges its bloody knife into the heart of Iraq and watches the country bleed out. The Iraqi people suffer deeply. On July 14th, France once again is attacked. 84 are killed and over 200 injured. Many are critical, including children and Americans, mowed down by ISIS in a truck after the Bastille Day festivities. It's a devastating attack against the French people on their National Day of Liberty. France as a nation has been hit with no less than 11 terrorist acts between 2015 and 2016. It's a clear example of an ideological liberal nation which has exposed itself to jeopardy through open borders, liberal immigration laws, and lacks attention to Islamic radical extremists growing in their provinces. And as a result, they've paid a very steep price. On July 22nd, ISIS strikes in Munich, Germany, killing 9 and injuring 36, attacking a church Christmas marketplace. Followed 2 days later in Afghanistan, where an ISIS attack in Kabul, the capital, kills over 80 people and injures more than 231. And then a vulgar ISIS attack occurs on an 84-year-old Roman Catholic priest in the middle of Mass. A couple of ISIS terrorists interrupt the worship and slit the throat of the priest in front of his parishioners. The very next day, on July 26, Bangladesh is attacked, killing 22 civilians, many of whom were Christian tourists. Their throats slit because they can't cite Quranic verses. And again, highlighting the anti-Christian hatred of ISIS Islamic terrorists. In August, ISIS attacks Turkey using a 12-year-old outfitted with a suicide vest and sending him into a wedding ceremony where he is detonated, killing 54 and wounding 94. Of those killed, 24 are innocent children. The very next day, Iraqi security catch and stop another 12-year-old boy, who ISIS has attached the suicide belt on. They defuse the explosives, saving the child and countless innocent civilians. We are reminded how hateful moral relativists are when they use children to do their dark deeds. Meanwhile, terrorism grows in America. In September, 41 people are injured in knife attacks and bombings by ISIS supporters. On the streets of New Jersey, the people are bombed, and in a Minnesota mall, they are attacked with knives. Also in September, a terrorist strikes a mall in Washington state, killing 5 with a gun, 4 of whom are innocent women. Out of a wilderness of hate and terror, one global leader steps up to confront the whirlwind of terror enveloping the world. On his way to the World Youth Rally in Poland, Pope Francis urges the world to recognize we are now facing a new world war, and it's upon us, no different than World War I or II. And he urges the world to pray and prepare to deal effectively with this old menace to humanity, the evil of empty hearts. America looks for their own leadership closer to home. Instead, they get political correctness and a president unwilling to call the threat against the nation just what it is: radical Islamic extremism. Despite his lack of courage to name it, the media questions him, the politicians criticize him, and America further realizes they don't have a leader at the helm. He's just a common politician, thinking he can protect his record, so long as he doesn't admit that Middle Eastern Islamic hatred has been inspiring terror in America. His weakness as a national leader is put on full display in January 2017, as he's finishing out his last few weeks in office. Shamefully, President Obama commutes the sentence for a convicted terrorist, one Oscar Lopez Rivera, for his involvement with the Puerto Rican separatist group. We call it for what it is: misleadership. Lopez ran the terror group, whose terror attacks were responsible for 100 bombings and the killing of 4 people in New York City and the injuring of several police officers. People across the nation, both conservatives and liberals, condemned Obama's self-serving action. It's without question a hideous act. In this single presidential maneuver, Obama's hubris is symbolic, condoning terrorism and acting against those who were victimized, and acting for the direct interest of the terrorists, and freeing a despicable man who remains unrepentant to this very day. In June, another striking example of misleadership occurs. we see the mayor of America's largest city, the boastfully liberal Bill de Blasio, marching with a convicted terrorist in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, clearly illustrating how left liberals in America are willing to shrug off terrorism to appeal to some vague notion of social justice. Organizers of the parade crowed, not only did Rivera lead it, but he was also, in a sense, designated the hero of the entire history of the celebration. Yet leadership from the incident did rise. Executives at AT&T announced that it was withdrawing its sponsorship of the parade. Leadership at Coca-Cola said that it was redirecting its support to a scholarship program associated with the event. And leaders at the Yankees, JetBlue, and Goya Foods said that they were cutting their ties with the parade or reducing their participation. At least these fine captains of industries weren't misguided by Obama or de Blasio's foolishness. This completes Part 2 of Social and Leadership. Please continue on by going to 6D, Part 3.